good lord, this camera is battered. It's a Canon 1DS Mark II, my first full-frame digital SLR, and it has had a hard life. It is a beast of a machine. Now, I bought this in 2004 and it was a major milestone for me. It was a big investment. It cost £6,000 and I went into debt to buy this. And it took me ages to pay it off, but it was a good investment because it enabled me to grow as a photographer and to progress my photography business. Now, I've shot hundreds, if not thousands, of successful assignments with this all over the world now, but it's retired. I've retired it. I now shoot the Canon 5D Mark IV and various other cameras. That doesn't mean to say, though, that I'm sure that there are still lots of other photographers, professional and amateur, that are producing amazing work with these cameras even today. And all power to you if you're still doing that, because we all know that it's all about the photographer, right? Not about the camera or the lenses. Now, this thing doesn't have all the bells and whistles of some of the latest cameras. It doesn't have a flip out screen or 4K video, but I can guarantee you one thing, and that is that if someone tries to rob you on one of your shoots and you whack them around the mush with one of these, they ain't going to be getting up anytime soon. This is a lump of a camera. It's a beast, incredibly well built. Now, what I'll do is I'll go on to talk about some of the good and bad things about the camera, my experiences of using it, and whether I think it's still relevant in this day and age. But first of all, I'll just show you a few of the pictures that I've taken with it over the years. Okay, so let's just go over the specs of the camera really quickly and talk about that. So it's a 16.7 megapixel full frame camera with a CMOS sensor. Shoots at 4 frames a second, which isn't the fastest thing in the world, but is actually kind of adequate for a lot of photographers. I think the buffer was sort of 30 frames before the buffer gets full. I'm not sure if that's RAW or JPEG. I do remember filling the buffer on this camera up and having to wait for it to write to the cards, but not that often. And so again, if you're a photographer that really wants, you know, a hugely fast motor drive and a big buffer, then this probably isn't the camera for you. But if you're work a bit slower, then it's fine. It's dual memory cards, which is cool. It's the first camera that I had that had dual memory cards, and that's great because it gives that extra level of security. The battery life on this camera was very good. I only ever had 2 batteries for it, never ended up having power issues, but they've both died because this is nearly 20 years old now. Both those cameras have died while it's been sitting up on my shelf, so I've had to plug it into the mains adapter. ISO capability, the camera will go up to 1600 with it. I think you could expand it to 3200, and if I remember rightly, it was a bit noisy at 1600. So I would typically have tried to keep this camera kind of 800 ISO, maybe 1600 at a push. But what's happened since my time of using this is that noise reduction software has got better. And so I may find that if I took this out and shot it now at 3200 and ran it through Lightroom with its more advanced noise reduction, then the pictures might be fine, don't know. So there's no video at all, that's it. You know, there's no live view, I don't even think, on this camera at all. So it's really rather basic in those terms. Okay, so what's good about it? One of the things that's wonderful about this camera is just the build quality and the ergonomic design. I'm talking photographically, not necessarily the menu system. You know, it just fits into my hand. It's like, it just feels like putting on a pair of old slippers. It just kind of, everything fits and feels great, exactly where you want it to be. All of the buttons are where you want them to be, in sensible place, and they've all got kind of nice positive action so that you know that you're pressing them. And it has the vertical shutter release and button system, which is great if you're shooting portraits. Really fantastic. And it's heavy and a beast, and the build quality is amazing. It's weather sealed, feels like a proper beast animal of a camera. It's not quite so true to talk about the buttons on the screen as being the most perfect thing in the world, because they require a little bit of, they're a bit unevolved is the best way of describing it. And the screen, I'm jumping into what's negative about the camera now, which isn't necessarily the right thing to do, but I will talk about it anyway. So the screen is small and low resolution, and the buttons are a bit difficult to navigate when you try and pull up a preview picture, for example. You have to kind of hold one down and press another one in order to be able to zoom in on the files. But everything works. It was an old camera. It is an old camera. It's a bit unevolved in terms of how that was all going to work, and Canon were kind of on a bit of a mission of discovery, really, to see what would work and what wouldn't. And so again, if you want something that has the very latest, there's no touch screen obviously, if you want something that's the very latest touch screen with evolved design and button menu system, then this might not be the thing for you. But everything is here and you can make it work. The buttons sort of became second nature to me, so I don't even know if I could remember how to do it, but not long after using this camera you become quite connected with it and you know how to do everything that you need to do, but it is a few steps away from being completely obvious. Okay, so the 16 megapixel sensor is great, by the way. I think that's a really nice size, and I think that I never had complaints over the size of the sensor or the file size, and for the time it was amazing. And when you think that kind of the Canon R6 is still only 20 megapixels now, there's not really a great deal of difference. And so the sensor is really nice. The dynamic range, I think I said, is not as good as modern cameras, so you have to be a little bit cautious about pulling up shadows or crushing highlights. But for a lot of photographers that's fine, because they just like to shoot straight out of the camera, and the Canon color science of this means that the files look great. So let's talk about negatives a little bit. So there's one huge negative, which is that it had no dust cleaning system. So the dust would accumulate on the sensor. And if you're going to shoot with one of these or have one of these old cameras that had no dust cleaning solution inside, you're going to get very familiar with one of these. And these sorts of things, which were the sensor brushes, which you take the lens off and go inside to try and get the dust out, or swabs or solutions. And I hated doing it because it always felt like I was taking my life in my hands with this very expensive beast of a camera. You can send them away and have them cleaned, obviously. And that's probably the most sensible thing to do, but I got quite used to cleaning the sensor myself because it was a pain. And I can remember doing a job in Valencia in Spain where I was shooting outside on a wide angle lens at sort of f8, f11 on a sunny day, blue skies, and all of the pictures had hundreds of little dust spots, and it just took me forever because each picture had to be opened. There was no, at that time there was no kind of clever software solution. You just had to open the picture in Photoshop and go in and dust spot each and every spot with the clone tool, and it sort of took, you know, hours and hours and hours. And so the dust is a major pain point with these cameras. Now, the next negative I would say is that the battery life, you need to be cautious if you're buying a second-hand one that the batteries are in good order. I do understand that it's a little bit of a problem. Other people have had it as well, and so that might be something that is worth just keeping in mind. And I suppose the big negative, the only other big negative, is that there are some other cameras available that are a bit newer and probably a bit fresher in terms of the AF speed, in terms of the dynamic range, in terms of the ISO, in terms of being a bit smaller, in terms of being just kind of more modern, I suppose, maybe having video. And, you know, I think you can pick these up for about £300 now. So it's a lot less than this thing was new, but it's still a lot of money. And so everyone will have to make up their own minds about whether or not this might be the right or wrong camera for them. There are other alternatives out there for a similar amount of money, much newer alternatives, which kind of do more. So, you know, if you're looking for something that's really newfangled with a lot of different options on it, then you might be better off looking elsewhere. But if you're the kind of photographer that's a bit kind of traditional and maybe likes things kind of a bit old school and is willing to take the time to work with a beast of a camera like this, then you probably enjoy it. Which leads me on to the next part of this video, which is whether or not I think it's relevant in this day and age. And you know, I think it still is, so long as you understand the limitations and you understand the nature of this camera, and you also understand yourself as a photographer and what it is that you want from a camera, then it might still be relevant for you. You know, this has been an absolute monster for me, and I've really put it through the ringer. It's had a hard life, and I feel so terrible that when I retired it, I still continue to use it as a time-lapse camera. So I put it on a tripod with a timer, and I would leave it firing thousands of frames to get an alternative view for a time-lapse. And then even after its time as a time-lapse camera, I started using it as a kind of almost expendable camera for my water sports photography. If I was doing a sailing shoot and the conditions got really bad, I would then pick this camera up so I wouldn't have to sacrifice one of my newer camera bodies. And it took all of that in its stride, and it's still working. It's covered in corrosion, but it's still there. It's an utter monster. And you know, I think that the interesting thing is that if you walked out today with this camera on one shoulder and a Canon R5 on the other, and took a bunch of pictures in reasonably good light and printed them at A3, I don't think many people would be able to tell the difference. So, you know, it's still a very capable camera. Although that wouldn't be the case if it was a goose flying towards you at twilight, because then the R5 would have a bit of an advantage, that's for sure. I hope this has been of some use to you and you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe and leave me a comment. I love to hear other people's opinions and thoughts. These things are all subjective, so it's just my opinion. Just leave me your comment and your thoughts on this camera and anything else photography related. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.